we have a media in this country that basically not just spouts the radical left line, but is the radical left. Now, there was a point in this history not that long ago of the country that people were required to show up in person to vote, that we had election judges at every precinct, and we had poll watchers at every precinct, different parties and so forth. And the goal was to make sure that the integrity of the vote was upheld. Not that everybody who wanted to vote could vote, but everybody who was qualified to vote could vote. And it really didn't take a lot of work when you consider, as you just saw in that clip, that we have men and women who put their lives aside and they join the military and they go overseas and they put everything on the line, their life, they leave their families. I mean, it's an extraordinary person who's willing to do that. Or we have here at home men and women in blue who leave their homes at night. They don't know if they'll come back. They don't know what they're going to confront. And some of them don't. Or some of them are severely injured, or some of them are abused by BLM and Antifa and other organizations. Again, for what they get paid, you have to wonder why they do that. But this takes real motivation. How much motivation does it take to get off your ass and go to a precinct and vote on voting day? Or if you can't, literally, physically or mentally, you have some kind of a handicap, then you can do an absentee ballot. Or if you're out of town, then you can do an absentee ballot. Or if you're overseas, you can do an overseas ballot. But other than that, there's no excuses. There's no excuses. The idea that people cannot go to a local precinct that is at worst within a couple miles of their home, and typically even closer. It's held at an elementary school, a middle school, a high school. It's held at a church or synagogue. It's held in a local facility. This is a great thing, where people have to show up and vote. Is that asking too much? Is that really asking too much? Of course it's not asking too much. And yet, one of the important things about voting that way is the integrity of the vote and the security system. Now, I don't know about you, but when I started to vote, I actually worked the precincts before I could vote, but when I started to vote, you would get in a line, you'd have to show an ID, typically a driver's license. They would open this big book of addresses and registers in that precinct. They would look at your driver's license, they would look at your face, then they'd look back down at the book, they'd see the address. They would ask you, what is your address? You would tell them your address. They would say, great. They would say, go over there where you would get an empty ballot. And we had paper ballots. You could still stick it in a computer, but a paper ballot, you fill it out privately at one of these desks or whatever you want to call them, where you stand up and you fill it out. You put it in the machine, and then they give you an I voted sticker, and you leave. Wow, the amount of work involved. I think that took 5 minutes. And on a busy election, maybe it took 20, 25 minutes. So what? So what? So now we're told that people can't do this. And we're told by Democrats that minorities are incapable of doing this. Why? Well, according to the Democrats, because they are race baiters and they stereotype their own supporters. Apparently, minorities are incapable of getting driver's licenses. Does anyone believe that? Or a state ID if you don't drive. And apparently they're exorbitantly expensive. Yet virtually every state that I'm aware of that requires a voter ID, they will give it to you for free, and they will mail it to you. You don't even have to come in and get it. Now, I'm a little sick and tired of this idea that we have to mail a ballot to every single person on some defective list, when this is a very mobile society, more mobile than ever before, and the lists don't keep up with the people. And this is why you can get an individual who gets multiple ballots in multiple states. Or this is why somebody passes, the state's not informed of it, at least they don't have the manpower or the know-how to change their voter lists, and the person shows up on their lists. Now, what the Democrats want to do, of course, is they want no voter ID. This is in their proposed law. No signature checking, no requirements of witnesses. They want to abolish all of that. They talk about individuals in the statute, not citizens. They allow 16 and 17-year-olds to register. Everybody else is registered automatically based on the list. Everybody will get a mailed-out ballot whether they ask for it or not. And counting can go as far as 10 to 15 days after Election Day. And it goes on and on and on. This isn't aimed at securing a legitimate vote. This isn't aimed at minorities and so forth. This is aimed at the Democrat Party doing whatever it possibly can in every part of the country to institutionalize fraud, to eliminate security measures, and to advance one-party power. It's that simple. Now, our media don't explain this. On every platform I have, this one, on Levin TV, on my Fox show, Life, Liberty, and Levin, behind the microphone on radio, day in and day out, I explain this over and over again, and I hope it's resonating. I believe it is. But you're not going to get it from these phony so-called straight news organizations. Here is Jake Tapper, and his claim is, of course, and he's not the only one, Republicans want to make it more difficult for people to vote. Now, Tapper's an old Democrat. He was a communications director for Marjorie Mezvinsky, who was a Democrat from Montgomery County, Pennsylvania, my old congressional district, for 2 years until she was thrown out. He was also communications director for Handgun Controlling. So he comes with a long pedigree of Democrat activism, and then they dress him up as a journalist, and this is what we get. Let's check it out. Go.
In the politics lead today, Texas is the latest state where Republicans suddenly want to make it more difficult to vote.
So there you go. Leave it there. Where Republicans suddenly want to make it more difficult to vote. He's a liar. He's a propagandist. Utterly contemptible and utterly corrupt. Go ahead.
24 bills that could restrict absentee ballots, they could limit voting hours, purge voter rolls faster, and more.
Purge voter rolls. Isn't that sinister? As a matter of federal law, states are required to make sure their voter rolls are accurate. It's not a matter of purging voter rolls. It's a matter of checking those rolls up against present-day residency, whether people are actually alive. In other words, there's a whole process for this, and it's a good thing. You want accurate rolls, don't you? They call it purging, making it more difficult for people to vote because their signature actually has to be their signature because they have to show up with an ID. Have you ever tried to get into the CNN building? They have security. You have to show an ID. And then they give you a pass that you have to wear around your neck. That's what goes on in his building. Look at what's going on in California. They have over 2 million people who've signed a petition to do what? To recall Gavin Newsom, the clown who's dressed up as a governor in California, who's done enormous damage to the people of that state. They're going to check those signatures on those petitions backwards and forwards. They're going to match the signatures. They're going to make sure those people live in the state. They're going to do all these things. But when it actually comes to voting, they reject all these things. I'm putting aside even the constitutional issues. The federal government doesn't have the power to nationalize all these state powers. The power to set up the electoral process and so forth is in Article 2, Section 1, Clause 2. It talks about state legislatures. Go ahead.
This to crack down on the widespread voter fraud that does not exist.
How does he know that widespread voter fraud does not exist? How does he know that? It's never been looked. Let me ask you a question. Why does the Internal Revenue have auditors? Why does the IRS have auditors? Why do we have an FBI that investigates fraud? Why do we have state and local law enforcement units that investigate fraud? Why do you have all kinds of statutes against embezzlement, wire fraud, mail fraud, all kinds of fraud? So the only place where there's not fraud is in voting. Isn't that amazing? The only place where there's not fraud is voting, and you have no evidence to prove otherwise. Well, we need to investigate and have hearings and collect. No, you don't understand. There is no evidence of fraud. None whatsoever. There's never been any evidence of voter fraud, has there, ladies and gentlemen? Now, this guy with a straight face, nonetheless a constipated look, but with a straight face, is lying to everybody who's watching his program. Of course there's fraud. There's fraud everywhere. Do you know the so-called stimulus bill that they put out? Hundreds of millions of dollars of fraud. Hundreds of millions of dollars in fraud. The only place where there's not fraud, apparently, is where the Democrats control the cities and the Democrats control the state. Now, this nation, we have a history of voting fraud, particularly in Democrat-controlled cities. Does Chicago ring a bell? New York City ring a bell? Philadelphia ring a bell? Detroit ring a bell? They should all ring a bell. So he's a liar.
Want to see more? Sign up for Levin TV.